once worked with a leader. His name was Alex, who was surrounded by people all day long. And just like you and me, he would attend meetings, he had emails, conversations from morning to night. Decisions were never ending, deadlines were ever present, and the pressure to perform was nonstop. Now, Alex, what made him unique is he was an expert in metrics and statistical modeling. And this enabled him to identify patterns and predict market trends well before anyone else. In fact, his uncanny knack for predicting the future and his reputation for what I always thought was transforming numbers into narratives earned Alex the nickname Oracle. Now, under such unrelenting conditions and guided by his own high internalized standards, Alex, he never dropped a ball. He never failed to meet expectations. He always seemed to be performing at his peak. Everyone around him, he worked miracles, and by every important metric, seemed to be on top of the world. Everyone, I'm telling you, everyone looked up to Alex, and no one wanted to let him down. And yet, in a quiet moment, Alex said something that stopped me cold. He said, "I've never felt more alone in my life." What Alex was describing wasn't isolation from people. It was disconnection with people. As the person who always seemed to be on a steeper learning curve than anyone else and 5 steps ahead of them too, Alex was universally respected. He was envied by most. And everyone placed him on the highest pedestal. Yet, because people were intimidated by his gifts, they didn't make efforts to connect with him. Well, you're probably wondering why. Well, they thought he was beyond them, kind of in a different class altogether. Now, what's amazing about Alex's story is that it illustrates how pervasive loneliness can be. And that's the topic of today, about loneliness. So welcome back to the Rethink podcast. I'm your host, Dr. David Zierk. This podcast is where we step back, pause, reflect, and explore smarter, more connected ways to lead and live by thinking with connection in mind, which is exactly what is meant by the word rethink. Relationship-enhanced thinking. Rethinking both your connection to yourself and to the others around you. That's what makes this podcast, I think, interesting and unique. We take any topic, any subject, any controversy, and look at it through the lens of relationship-enhanced thinking, the ability to think with connection in mind. Today, we're going to rethink loneliness and talk about a kind of loneliness that often goes unnamed, especially at work and in long-standing important relationships. This is the loneliness that shows up when you feel misunderstood or mistreated for too long by too many people in your everyday walk of life. Now, when a pattern of being misunderstood or mistreated establishes itself, becomes ingrained within, the message you keep receiving, directly or indirectly, is I don't matter. I don't matter. Now, even further, when you're surrounded by people who are bouncing ideas off of each other, while your thoughts and opinions seem to be pushed aside, and no one seems to understand how bad these feelings are that you hold inside of being rejected or ignored, the other message that you're receiving loud and clear is you don't get me. So there it is. The experiences of you don't get me and I don't matter, they have a rhythm to them. And that rhythm is what I call the parting tide, T-I-D-E. The time when things drift apart, start to unravel, or your passion for engagement just dwindles. Now let's get back to Alex. For Alex, the parting tide was not being mistreated in an off-putting or any kind of disparaging way. Far from it. He was a rock star. It was not being treated like a person whom people can enjoy for who he is, not for what he does. Remember his high performative standards? He's the rock star. He's the person who everyone looked up to. The experience of being placed in this exalted position without his permission and being admired from afar left Alex feeling disconnected and distant from others. This example illustrates how tricky loneliness can be, even under what appears to be the best of conditions. So let's start breaking it down and really get into this concept called tide. The ebb and flow of life can be likened to the tide. In fact, if you came to my office, you'd see many pictures of the tide. It's so captivating, it's so moody, it's so symbolic of life. Because tides reflect this natural rhythm that mirrors the human experiences through this constant motion. Just as the tide rises and falls, life brings periods of growth and challenge and even transformation. Knowing about the tide and its impact on your life puts you back in control and on the path to becoming a healthier and stronger you. So TIDE is an acronym. I'm going to pull it up on my whiteboard. It's an acronym that captures what happens emotionally when your connection with others and eventually with yourself erodes over time, leaving behind this loneliness that persists, even when you're surrounded by others at work and even at home. So let's dig into this. The first letter is T. And it stands for a sense of feeling trapped. Great word that describes so much of life. The part of loneliness that feels like you're confined within these like invisible walls, unable to break free from an overwhelming sensation of being caged and left powerless to do anything about it. Welcome to the trap. This is when hope turns into kind of a distant memory, and it's replaced by frustration and despair and other negative sensations that seem so familiar. When each day feels like a loop, the future is overwhelmed by the past repeating itself. And like I've said in other podcasts, the past is always the problem. And when your past and your unwanted past and your unwelcome past continues to repeat itself, well, you can see why this trap is so strong. And that's just the first part of the tide. But certainly understand that you can be trapped by your circumstances, but you can also be trapped by your own psyche. That your past continues to repeat itself. And every time it repeats itself, it kind of accentuates. It becomes more amplified, more certainly recognizable. So welcome to the trap. Now, let's keep going and go to the next letter. And this has to do with isolation. So first off, you feel trapped by your circumstances or by your own psyche. And then isolation comes along. Isolation it's kind of known as like the hallmark of loneliness. Feeling isolated results from not only being physically separated from others, but a person can also be surrounded by others, yet feel completely alone if they lack authentic and organic connections. I've known many people who experience that same quality of life, where they're surrounded by others, but the lack of quality of connections leaves them feeling despaired. And what I'd like to share with them is that the experience of being unseen or unheard intensifies the loneliness that began when you were feeling trapped in that silent, invisible cage we talked about. This is when negative thoughts spiral and emotions begin to escalate and get out of control. And then those dark memories, and they echo so loudly and so resolutely. The solitude then becomes suffocating. So here we are, trapped by our circumstances or our psyche. It leads to a sense of isolation that feels so profound. Impenetrable, perhaps, is a better word. So there we are. And now we're going to go to the D. This has to do with deprivation. Deprivation, being deprived. Loneliness is amplified by the deprivation of not having one's most, what I call primal relational needs met. Let's talk about those primal relational needs met. We've covered them in a previous podcast, but it's so important that I need to keep bringing it back, because the short list of needs, what it is that we need, want, desire, and deserve, that we can't give ourselves, that we're dependent upon others, includes attention, affection, acknowledgement, approval, and applause. Now, I know I went through that very quickly, but I just want you to know that that's the list. When you're deprived of, you're not being attended to. Nothing happened in your life that feels good, affectionate. Acknowledgement is not happening. There's no approval around, and certainly no applause is happening. Now, when these needs, these primal needs, go unmet, we can end up feeling emotionally starved, undernourished. And this happens when, instead of being the subject of the attention, affection, acknowledgement, approval, and applause, those 5 attachment needs that I mentioned, instead of getting that, instead of becoming the subject of those, you become the object. The object of what? The object of being forgotten, ignored, hurt, dismissed, rejected, or treated with indifference. Now just think about that. That's really profound. Because on the other side of the coin, instead of someone giving you attention, they ignore you. They forget about you. Instead of someone saying or do something that has an affectionate quality to it, you feel hurt. Instead of being acknowledged for what you are, who you are, and what you've done, you get dismissed. You get dismissed. And instead of being approved of your performance or your sense of self, you get rejected. And here's the one that I think happens all the time. It's almost epidemic. Instead of putting their hands together and giving you a sense of applause, really rooting you on for who you are and what you do, you get treated with indifference. So instead of booing and hissing, which perhaps somehow we can deal with, when people are indifferent towards you, what you do and who you are doesn't seem to make a difference. That sense of indifference has a really deep existential quality to it of despair, which leaves us feeling substantially and resolutely deprived. So we've been trapped, we've been isolated, and now we've been deprived. And there's one more letter in this acronym of the T.I.D.E. So the end result of this cascade of being trapped, isolated, and deprived is a sense of emptiness. When I say emptiness, I'm probably touching into the most human experience where we feel completely empty. And perhaps it's the most poignant aspect of loneliness. This emptiness is ultimately what gets created as a direct result of this ongoing sequence of being trapped, isolated, and deprived. This void isn't just a lack of company. It's like an emotional hollowness that can pervade your existence and sense of purpose, leaving you even questioning the meaning of your life. Yes, this is how serious loneliness becomes and how important organic connections are to your soul. Like a real tide, this process of feeling trapped or isolated, deprived, and empty, it's gradual. It comes on slowly, almost imperceptibly. And once the parting tide begins moving, going against it feels exhausting, sometimes even impossible. It seems to have a life of its own, that current. This is why people stay stuck longer than they should. Not because they don't know something is wrong, but it's more like thinking about the concept of tide. It's more like because they have this emotional current feels stronger than their energy to fight it. It's like they're up against unwinnable odds. Let me give you an example at work of how the tide is experienced, because it often shows up in this experience called occupational burnout. Now, you might feel trapped by your expectations, caught in an unending cycle of demands, and there's no clear path to relief or recovery. Perhaps that sounds familiar. This sense of entrapment can very easily lead to isolation and feelings of being misunderstood. They compel you to increase the distance with others because there's safety with distance. But when you distance yourself from others, you're further exacerbating your sense of emptiness and powerlessness. You can see this cycle, how it creates itself, and the tide gets an energy of its on its own. So isolated in conversations, and they never go deeper than surface level. You remind yourself of your lack of depth and disingenuousness of your relationship at work. So you go to work, you chit-chat, doesn't seem important, doesn't seem all that relevant, you kind of push through it. It's not meeting your needs. It's actually contributing to your sense of emptiness. So when people initiate small talk, you might think, your private thought might be, they're just being polite. In the end, deprived of acknowledgement or any kind of encouragement or appreciation for who you are and what you do, you probably guessed it, you eventually become empty. Your tank runs out. That's occupational burnout. And this further depletes your drive to break the cycle or ask for help, make yourself vulnerable and tell people what's going on, or do anything that might help your situation. Now, shifting gears just a little bit, in personal relationships, the pattern looks really similar. You might be technically together, but emotionally disconnected. Now, the relationship exists, yet it's no longer nourishing and hasn't been for a long time. In fact, it's been forever since you last felt anything other than a sense of not being enough or brooding, not because you're sad, but because the feeling of nothingness has become too familiar and recognizable. That's how pervasive emptiness can be. Again, emptiness can have a life of its own. The process associated with departing tide when you're at work contributes to and explains the deeply private experience of occupational burnout that we were just talking about. And when the same pattern occurs in an important relationship, it's called emotional burnout. Either way, the sense of disconnection from yourself and others, it's triggered by a pattern of being misunderstood or mistreated, or maybe a combination, maybe a little bit of both, being misunderstood and mistreated. Now, when we are understood and we are treated with love and respect, those are being validated. And when we're misunderstood and we're mistreated, those are forms of invalidations. And even when they're subtle, I call them micro invalidations. And here's the key insight. Feeling lonely in a room full of people is often more painful than being alone. Perhaps you've had that experience when you walk into a conference center and you're surrounded by 100 people. You don't know anyone. You sit down at one of the designated tables and everyone seems to connect naturally, to be talking very, very organically. And then there you are, feeling profoundly alone, awkward as can be, lonely. So here's our call to action. Because you always have to ask yourself, now that we know about this parting tide and we have a really good way to recognize the importance of this loneliness through the model of the tide, being trapped and isolated, being deprived of what it is that you really need and deserve, and ultimately feeling empty, I want you to notice something this week. want you to ask yourself, where might the tide be going out in your life right now? Is it at work? Occupational burnout? Is it happening in a key relationship? Are there aspects of emotional burnout that you might be experiencing? Or maybe in how you relate to yourself. It's what I would call existential burnout. So it's kind of interesting, isn't it? The same model of the tide begins to explain your interactions with other people at work, occupational burnout. You're no longer passionately connected to the mission at play in terms of doing what you need to do and what you've been really good at. You lose your drive. Or in an important relationship, there's a sense of indifference about it all. It doesn't seem to be moving in a positive direction. It doesn't seem to elicit anything passionate. Emotional burnout. And you may even have an ultimate disconnect with your sense of self, questioning your purpose, your value in life. And that's what I would call the existential burnout. Now, remember that awareness is the first act of self-respect. So being aware. And that's what's powerful about this model. I give it to you not just to be coy and to be clever, but to really help you understand that you can organize what's going on in your life, put a label or a title to it, dissect it, and become more intimately familiar with what's going on, because awareness is that first act of self-respect, which starts the process of living beyond self-protection. Now, that's really important because when you are trapped, isolated, deprived, and feeling empty, it's very, very natural to go into a very, very desperate form of self-protection. Again, you isolate yourself from others, you avoid things that might go even worse. Because the mind has a tendency to say, well, if it's gone from good to bad, it very likely could go from bad to worse and maybe worse to ugly. It begins to project negativity. And that's the reason why self-protection is such a natural reflex of the mind. So next, I want you to reflect on where you might be feeling a bit trapped by your circumstances. And consider those moments when you're disconnected from certain people and ask, am I feeling isolated? Now, some people take breaks from people or situations just to re-energize their battery. So I'm not saying disconnections from people is always bad, but it's really why I'm trying to ask you to be very honest with yourself and saying, my disconnect with other people, is there a theme or a pattern to it? And if so, is it a reflection of or a clue that I might be isolating myself, and that's what I might be feeling? And my tide, my inner sense to my soul, my connection with my soul might be parting. And perhaps the distance you feel from others is merely circumstantial, and it can be corrected by taking a risk or joining in. You can be very self-correcting very quickly. And here's another thing. If you're the type of person who dislikes chaos and seeks calm and stability, perhaps the distance you feel from others is self-created. So I'm asking you again to not be hard on yourself if you're the kind of person who really seeks serenity. But if it comes at a cost of embellishing or strengthening the connections with the people who are important to you, you have to be careful of that, because that makes you vulnerable to this sense of loneliness. So as such, instead of maintaining the peace that you've become famous for, you've taken things too far and perhaps you've created something much lonelier. And I call it silence. And silence is what's golden, of course. But when you hear yourself and you don't hear voices, other voices coming at you, reflecting back to you, or giving you any kind of feedback, that silence can be an indicator of loneliness. So if any of this sounds remotely familiar and independence feels more like exile, it's vital to know that the antidote to the persistent ache of loneliness lies not in the mere presence of others, but stepping into and cultivating meaningful connections, investing in personal growth opportunities, and re-anchoring yourself in a sense of purpose. That's easier said than done, but now that it has been said, I think it points us in directions of growth. So if today's conversation resonates, I want you to keep this in mind. Loneliness is not a sign of weakness. It truly is a reflection of the human condition. It happens to all of us now and again. And for some, of course, far too often. Keep in mind that loneliness reflects that you're responding to unmet relational needs. It's the deprivation we're talking about. That what it is that you need, want, desire, and deserve from other people that you can't give yourself, the attention, affection, acknowledgement, approval, and applause, either it's not coming or not coming with enough frequency to feed your soul. But when these unmet relational needs happen that every human being has, and you go into that state of depression, just be aware of it. Just be aware of it. And use the model of the tide to help organize what's going on in your private world. So understanding the parting tide puts you back in control of what comes next. So after talking about the parting tide today, in the next episode, I'll walk you through what I call riding the tide, then stemming the tide, and finally turning the tide. And that's how real change begins. So with that note, I'd like to invite you to visit my website at davidzierk.com, where you can sign up for my newsletter called Refresh, or download an endless stream of resources. You can read a blog or two or learn more from my quizzes and look at my speaker topics. I also have a YouTube channel, and it's called Whiteboard Psychology. This is where I make learning about psychology visible, and I do it in a very short period of time. We take topical issues that are related to the field of psychology. I put it up on the whiteboard. We talk about it in a short period of time, and hopefully you walk away with a golden nugget. I also share quick tips on relationship intelligence, turning conflict into connection, on YouTube and Instagram. So overall, that's my introduction to loneliness, reframing it through the TIDE model. And that's why doing this is really rewarding and fun. So until next time, keep rethinking how you show up and do life.